Okay. So to reiterate, you came here from Filthy Heretics channel?
Server.
Server, Filthy Heretic server. So how would you say your views mostly overlap with his then?
Yeah, I would say so. Politically, I align with him as a voluntarist. Uh, Ethically, I will, during this debate, I'll arrive at different arguments in natural law to justify my position
Other arguments than natural law?
than natural law.
Then natural law. Okay. All right. Well, I'm gonna assume you have some sort of opposition to my stance, and my stance is in opposition to voluntarism. So, how would you prefer to start this off?
Uh, I would like us to define, how would you define your system, right? How would you define minarchism? And I would define what I mean by voluntarism, and then we can arrive at two different definitions. That's fine, and we'll see where we can go from there. But I think defining our terms is key in order to discuss everything else.
Okay. Well, I would keep it very simple and say that minarchism is a small government that entails a state, that entails society, that entails laws, that entails rules, and that overall implies a state monopoly on force.
Okay. Sorry, state monopoly on force.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I would usually, because for me that sounds like a tautology. I already define the state as a monopoly on the use of force in a given geographical area. That's how I would define the state.
I would say the state is just the governments of a geographical area. But I really wasn't defining it in that way. I was just elaborating that, yes, your government, a government, entails a monopoly of force. Otherwise, it's not a sustainable government.
True. And that government, to be fair, purports to the initiation of force. That's the primordial version of force that government resorts to. It's the initiation of force.
I'm not sure what point you're trying to make exactly. The primordial.
Well, because right, the essential characteristic of what type of force government uses is the initiation of force. We're describing what type of force government is using. Because when I say, or when people say government is a monopoly over the use of force, well, they're not describing what type of force it commits. They're just throwing force out there as a word.
I'm not. I personally don't see that it really matters what kind of force we're referring to, honestly. You might think it matters because you might use force in terms of like self defense,
Right? There's
but
people.
states can also use force in that manner. So it's not explicitly just, initiation of force.
But that state can only preserve its existence through the initiation of force. That's what
Through
I mean by
enforcing its laws.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because all I would consider laws a blanket set of rules that are signed and enforced under duress by a central governing agency. In this case, it's the state.
Not necessarily under duress, but they can be under duress.
What do you mean, not necessarily under duress?
Well, I don't object to all laws enforced on me.
Sure, but
I'm sure most statists you talk to would say much of the same.
right, but you objecting to something doesn't take away the coercive component of laws. I mean, there is no law that
Well,
you can consent to. It's
you we
impossible.
weren't really talking about coerce. You're talking about duress.
Well, if something is used under duress, and I don't want to get into semantical issues this early into discussion. If something is enforced under duress, well, it begs the question. It's already enforced. You can't. There is no say. For example, I don't have any say in freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. I didn't sign the Constitution, so in no way, shape, or form is that a valid form of a social contract, which I view a contradiction in terms. So, yeah, when you say under duress, the first thing that appears in my mind is coercion.
Well, that's fine, but again, it's not just coercion. It's not a synonym for
Right, not
coercion.
just coercion, but
Yeah,
coercion is one of those elements.
sure, but you can't omit all the context that makes the word the word. So if all I did was just Google duress, threats,
Okay.
violence, constraints, or other actions used to coerce someone into doing something, that would all fall under it, against their will or better judgment. Now, it's not against my will for you to enforce certain rules on me. So
Sure,
you
I can
can't,
enforce certain rules on you as
and
long
it,
as you consent to it,
no,
but that's not the same as saying,
whether I explicitly consent to it or not, it's not necessarily duress because I don't necessarily object to it either.
well, you can subordinate yourself to a multitude of different rules. Like, for example,
Sure.
employment is you subordinating yourself to a boss in order to earn a wage, but that's not the same thing as you being
That's,
subordinated to the state
yeah.
and complying with laws that you had no say in.
No, but again, those aren't necessarily putting me in duress because I'm not necessarily objecting to them. It's not against my will for there to be a law against murder. I wholly accept there being a law against murder. That is a law
Okay.
which was passed without my explicit consent. I didn't agree to that law. I didn't sign on to that social contract. And yet it's not imposed on me in duress because I don't object to that law.
Okay.
That's just the exception I'm making here. Not trying to make it a semantic issue. I'm just giving
Okay.
you, my perspective.
So, uh, so you've already so far what you've described government as is a state monopoly on force or a monopoly over the use of force. Am I correct?
I would say a government is downstream of a state, but a state is not downstream of a government
Okay.
necessarily. It depends on how we're talking about it. I
Okay.
would say I would say at the base we're talking about a government, and then if you're talking about a government in the context of location, then you're referring to a state.
Okay. Because I'm glad you brought that up because people use state interchangeably with country, and country, if we're gonna use the hyphenated term nation state, well, a nation by definition already has a monopoly over the use of initiatory violence in a given geographical area. That's how I would define the nation state as. And you're defending this uh, monopoly over the use of initiatory force in a given geographical area. Now, setting those definitions aside, I want to know why you believe uh, why the monopoly over the use of initiatory violence is at least an essential characteristic in order for society to function. Because even before we're having this debate and we're laying principles in opposition to each other, uh, you know, there is an end goal that each one of our principles is trying to reach, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean that in the consequentialist manner. I mean that eventually we want to see some positive outcome based off of our principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so why do you defend minarchism? What brought you to the minarchist position in the first place?
Well, I'm personally in favor of freedom. I strongly object to this overarching what is often called the nanny state, just this massive government that decides to stick its hands in fucking everything. But the logical extreme to that is anarchy. And in anarchy, there's nothing that could possibly protect you against each other other than each other. And so you do have to have some sort of rules to some extent. And so that's why I say there should be a minimum necessary degree of control over what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in society. So only the most fundamental things should be established and enforced, if at all possible.
And by necessary, you mean the police, the court system, the military, you know?
Those are, your basic night watchman state. I would at the very least begin with those.
Okay. Well, what do you mean by begin? I mean, I would
Well,
say that's where it ends.
I
That's where it begins and it ends.
I'd say I'm open-minded to other arguments for other options, and suffice it to say, there's stuff that the state does that does not necessarily pertain to only those things. For example, if you're to have any sort of foreign affairs, it makes sense that you would have an agency as part of your government which deals specifically with international diplomacy. That doesn't neatly fall into this concept of a judiciary or domestic and international security, but it's something I can totally see being a necessary function of government.
Okay.
But insofar as we're talking about a state in isolation, I would definitely say, yeah, police, military, judiciary. Although military kind of bootstraps the whole international affairs thing.
Okay. Now, you said something interesting that under anarchism, right, there's nowhere to go, basically, what you said, that you have no viable way of protecting yourself from other people because there's no rules.
I
Well,
wouldn't say that.
okay.
It's not as though you couldn't protect yourself without a state. You can protect yourself without a
You
state.
can protect yourself without a state, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's certainly no ideal solution. When it comes to, for example, the recent riots that have taken place, when it comes to the recent riots that have taken place, a lot of people, there's been a massive surge in gun sales. Well, why are people buying guns? Well, because obviously they want some means of being able to protect themselves, if that's at all possible. And it's at least to some degree possible if you personally own a firearm. Now, is one firearm necessarily going to save you against a mob of people burning down your house? No, it's most definitely not. But it's something, all right?
But
And
that's an issue of might makes right, right? Where,
I
a
don't know how
group of
you jump to
people,
that.
well, because, if you're outnumbered by a mob, which is
Mm-hmm.
a group of people with torches and pitchforks, right, coming at you, and you're just, a one-man army, who do you think is
Mm-hmm.
going to win that fight?
Well, there you go. That's why such a thing as monopoly on force is a thing.
The thing about the monopoly or the use of force is that I would argue that that mob has already centralized the use of force in a given geographical area.
I would disagree with that. Of
How
course,
so?
that sort of question lends itself to asking like what sort of, government you're talking about in the first place, too.
So now the question shifts to which government it is,
Well,
because
if you're going to be critiquing the United States, you'd be critiquing a Republican form of government. If I were to talk
Sure.
about my ideal form of government, I'd be talking about a constitutional direct democracy, which is not is neatly, transposable into mob rule, as you might think. I assume you're driving.
Yeah. So, can you repeat that? A constitutional direct democracy. Because I
Yeah,
view those terms in conflict with each other. When I think of a direct
really.
democracy, is uh, you know, uh, people's votes, the
Mm-hmm.
majority votes on what laws should be passed, and
Mm-hmm.
it gets directly passed based off of their votes. It's not like a representative democracy where we just vote people in and then they, pass the laws,
I would
right?
say that's not a democracy. I would think the concept of a representative democracy is just extraordinarily flawed in general. The closest you can get to describing something as a representative democracy, let alone a direct democracy, is what you have in Switzerland. Switzerland gives people a lot more control over how the state is run. And it's not exactly a libertarian state, but at the same time, it's not exact. You couldn't really call it mob rule either.
Sure, but that's
I would say
if
they've even
uh,
made some.
fit. So if because so first of all, the system
You're you're going robot on
of
us.
it's basically a faction. Well, let me check the connection. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Okay. So the in Switzerland it functions by cantons, and basically the issues I have with the direct democracy is, you said it doesn't function as mob rule. I think it's exactly what mob rule is. If 51% of the population votes to take away your stuff in order to redistribute it in the name of social justice, they can do that. It's all determined by the votes of the majority, suppressing the minority. So how would, because when you say a constitution,
yeah.
minarchists usually say that the constitution is to protect the minority from the majority in all respects, whether if it's
I
in
would
a
completely
direct
disagree with
form
that.
of government. Okay. Whether if it's in a direct form of government that I just described, where 51% of the population votes to take away your stuff, or 51% of the population votes in a politician.
You're roboting again.
So I wanted to finish my point on the direct form of democracy and the representative form of democracy. I just view it two different sides on the same coin. The direct form of democracy is 51% of the population voting to take away your stuff. If that's not coercive enough, I can't think of anything else that couldn't be coercive as that, right? And a representative democracy, yeah, a representative democracy is 51% of the population voting in for Donald Trump, and Donald Trump forcing me to pay for his wall. How do you view those different forms of government? And supposedly the Constitution was established in order to protect me from those two forms of government. So how does
You,
your let me finish. How does your conception of constitutional direct democracy work in that case?
well, you're asking me to distinguish between a republican, a republic versus a democracy, which I don't like calling republics representative democracies because it's not the people voting; it's an oligarchy of people voting. And originally, this started out as asking how democracy is different from mob rule, which are two separate questions. So, which one are you wanting us to focus on?
All that what you've described is conglomerated into one another, at least in my conception. A republic is a democracy for
It's
me.
real. It's not because it's not ruled by the people though. Especially,
Really?
no, it's
Then
not.
then 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 why does this country have elections then?
It's I don't know. It seems awful wasted, doesn't it? Isn't there a minority of people who actually vote in the president, and then the president himself actually makes like the fucking laws and shit? Well, not
Uh
all the laws, of course, but isn't it actually a minority of people who run this country, and it's a majority of people who feign a bipartisan vote in order to choose who actually runs it?
no, that's not exactly how it works. So in this country, uh, there's a separation of powers,
Mm-hmm.
and the president doesn't make all the laws, at least theoretically.
No.
The person in charge of the executive branch doesn't make all the laws. Everything primarily has to go through the legislative branch, through Congress. Congress is a
No,
conglomeration
I'm
of the
aware of
Senate
all
and the
this.
House and House of Representatives. Okay, and those representatives in governments, which you said are a minority of the population, which you are correct, still are voted in by the majority of people voting in this country.
But the majority of
So
people are not making the policy. They only have.
the majority of people aren't making this policy, but the people in government are supposed to represent what we voted for.
But that doesn't
That's
happen.
why.
We specifically would not have had Trump if there was not a specific minority of people in government whose job it is specifically to have the power under the Constitution, as it happens, to pervert the popular vote and put forward an electoral vote. So, under popular vote, Hillary Clinton would have been president, but we have Trump instead. So it was not
Okay.
majority. It was not a majority vote that put Trump in power to make you pay for his wall. It was electorates.
Yes, but it's the aggregate number of electorates in each state. That's still a form of you know you could say a democratic form of government there
What what
because
what
people
value
are.
what value is a democracy if the democracy is actually limited to less than 1% of the population? Like what is the going rate of democracy? What is the weighted value of anything you could term democracy if that small of the population actually has a say in how the government is run? Is that ruled by the people or is that ruled by only some people?
I think you're viewing it as a distinction in numbers because
I'm
you
viewing
know
it well, that's kind of how I do view it because if you're like the whole Hobbesian distinction is, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, ruled by the many, the few, or the one. United States is a nation which is ruled by the few. It is not a monarchy, but it is neither democracy either. It's a republic, specifically a federal republic.
okay.
And that falls under the aristocracy umbrella. You're not It is not the people who are voting on policy, it is politicians who do that. And yeah, you vote in the politicians, but the politicians do whatever the fuck they want once they're in power. And under a direct democracy might be able to actually recall those politicians if they did not actually do what they were supposed to do as delegates. But we don't have that power either in the United States. Referendums are virtually unheard of.
They're unheard of, but they still exist. Like
Sure, but is that like
if I want to petition a certain law in order to come into existence, I can. Right? Just because something is
everyone
unheard
can
of,
everyone can petition a thing. That's not the same thing as a referendum, though.
I said petition something into a law. That's
Yeah.
what I said.
Well, specifically what I was referring to is repealing laws or
Okay,
people put into power.
that's fine.
Anyway,
So, yeah,
I would strongly distinguish democracy from mob rule, and especially a constitutional democracy, primarily due to the fact that there's structure to it. There's a deliberate method to how you apply the decisions of a group of people onto the rest of society. If it's mob rule, it's just whoever can fucking get at you first. It's whatever the whims of the populace end up being. It's not constrained by votes. It's not constrained by a formal system of delegation. It's not constrained by constitutional rights.
yeah.
So the whole hypothetical 51% of people can vote to take all your shit away. Well, no, they can't. If it's your constitutional right not to have all your shit taken away.
Well, what if I want to overthrow the state, as the Constitution says, and I want to establish my own? How do you stop me?
Well, by a monopoly on force. That is the best any
And
state has. Other than, obviously, a culture of, engaging in the political process, getting everyone involved, having a say, not creating a whole bunch of animosity between haves and haves and have-nots. That will certainly incentivize revolution. Numerous states throughout history have experienced revolutions specifically because of that sort of shit. So it's important that you get that stuff right the first time. And if not the first time, then you work on it. You work and
okay,
you work and you work.
well, you
Otherwise,
said
nothing's hypothetically to stop anyone in theory from taking over the government somehow. But it's especially unlikely under a direct democracy. Because under a direct democracy, your enemy is the entire population of the nation.
right.
It's not just one dictator in power or a group of people at a council table,
So let me go back to the point you addressed. You said that a monopoly on force is the only thing that could stop mob rule. That could stop the situation and me wanting to overthrow that state and establishing a new one in a given geographical area. Am I correct?
It's the foremost. It's the foremost thing which prevents it. Yes.
Okay. And what if I have uh, a you have competing force agencies that want to overthrow the government, and there's a competition on force that wants to overthrow the state. And
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by a competition on force is that there's a plurality of people competing
Mm-hmm.
in order to overthrow the people in power.
Mm-hmm.
How then does a monopoly on force uh, prevent itself from dissipating into mere non-existence from a competition on force? Is what I want to know.
I'm really not sure what you're suggesting there. Like I know the whole stereotypical, you know, private security forces or whatever you call them.
It's called the warlords problem. What if a group of warlords
I
wanted to overthrow the U.S. federal government? What now?
I really don't know what to tell you. What do you think?
Well, I don't know either.
What is your hypothetical? What is the hypothetical end game here? The force is either stopped or the state is incapable of stopping it. I don't know which direction you want me to take with this argument, so you can hit me with the gotcha.
Not hitting. I'm not hitting you with a gotcha. You're just consequentially arguing that a monopoly on force would stop mob rule in the
It
foremost
should stop
occasion.
mob rule. That should be part of its job description.
Okay, then that's a normative statement. Then
It
not a. You can't.
absolutely is a normative statement. It's a
Then
normative
then
statement to say society should be a direct democracy too.
okay. Given that you're obviously making a normative statement, then why
Mm-hmm.
do you say that the role of government should be to protect people from mob rule is the same as saying government will protect people from mob rule? That's two different things.
I'm sorry. What's the issue?
I need to check something in my car. What I was saying was, so first you made the point that um, a monopoly over the use of force is going to shield people away from the potential dangers of mob rule.
Yeah.
Okay. Steel man your argument.
Okay.
And then you said that no, government should protect people from mob rule. That's two different things. You're
They are
saying
two different things, but they're not mutually
okay.
exclusive. The whole purpose of having a monopoly on force is to preserve this current structure of power. So it explicitly serves to defend against shit that will create power vacuums, anarchies, overthrows, coups d'etats, whatever you want to call it. That's its job. It's there for that reason. That doesn't mean it's always going to be successful. And throughout history, we know that's not always successful, but that should be its job.
Okay. And note, by the way, up to now, I haven't made any consequentialist arguments for my system. I'm
That's
just
fine.
simply, yeah. Uh, so, given that you said that government should protect the rights of people, and government, uh, in most pragmatic cases, will protect the rights of people, aren't two different things, but are also not mutually exclusive. How would you connect the is and the out there? How do you get from, you know, the your normative interpretation of what government ought to do, and the descriptive is what it actually does do? So,
Well, I think I'd take an issue with that. What it does, and what it is are two separate things. And so, if we were making a descriptive statement, we'd be talking about what it is, not necessarily what it does, right?
well,
So there's
well,
what it is and what it ought to be.
well, action presupposes existence. So, government can only act, obviously, if it exists. Now, my main focus on this debate is trying to examine what government does and why I'm against it.
Okay.
Forget about what you define it as. We're talking about what it does. So how would you said
Well,
that
government does a lot of different things. So
okay.
if we're going to share any sort of criticisms on the generic concept of government, we're going to have to agree on what government necessarily does by definition.
Okay.
Because there are governments that will cause its own people to die of famine. There are governments that will charge an over 50% income tax rate. There are governments that will ban weed and, order the execution of gay people, right? Not all governments do this. Some governments
Yes.
do this. All of it's possible under the pretext of a government, but not all of it's necessary under the pretext of government. So there's only so many things you can specifically blame on government. Beyond that, there's just certain policies or maybe even politicians that you would hang, those sins on. Government is just a tool, in my opinion. You can use it for good, you can use it for bad. Now, if you fundamentally disagree with that, then we're going to have to get down to why government is fundamentally bad.
And that's where I want to lead us toward.
Okay.
So, and I'm the main purpose why I'm discussing this is because I want to interpret what your arguments are in the most non-strongman way possible, because there's been a gazillion debates on minarchism versus voluntarism, and it's strawman on both sides. So
Well, I
I want,
appreciate
in
that.
order to avoid that, I want to steelman your argument. So
Thank you.
yeah, for your conception of the limited state, you said that the state uh, should be limited to the police, the military, and the judiciary.
At a
The
minimum, yes.
At a minimum. Okay. So I'm gonna dissect those three realms, and then you can give a counter argument if you want, or a rebuttal to how I view those three different realms.
Are we
I'll
going to
start
do
with
them one at a time?
one at a time.
Okay.
So the way I view the police, well, yeah, let's just start with that, because with all that's been going on in the past few weeks, you know, for me, if you look at the history on how the police was established, it was established as slave patrol in Boston, Massachusetts in 1841.
Just had someone else telling me that the other day.
Yeah. And the very existence of the police during that time was not to protect people from violence. I've never purported as such as the police's function is to protect people. The function of the police is to enforce laws that the state has preordained via, either legislation or another form of a coercive contract that individuals have no consent towards, obviously, because no one can consent towards a piece of legislation. That's impossible. So I'll first make the moral case on why I think the police is bad, and then I'll get to the practical case on why I believe the police is bad, and why I think, private security guards would be much more efficient in this case.
Okay.
First of all, the police, I don't want to use bad, I want to use a better word. The establishment of the police is immoral because the actions that it inflicts on other people is by definition asymmetrical. And what I mean by asymmetrical is that the very preordained establishment of the police's authority is that, they have made no argument as to why their authority is justified, right? And this is what Filthy Heretic was saying in his video with you. It's just that both the initiation of force caused by government and the initiation of force caused by the police are results of circular reasoning. They're just saying, I'm in charge because I'm in charge, right?
Yeah, I disagree with that.
They provided no justification, no form of logical argumentation that abides by the principle of non-contradiction. And yeah, well, I don't know why you're laughing at
Well,
that,
can
because
I?
the principle of non-contradiction is important when
It is.
examining if an argument is false or
I
not.
completely agree, but can I jump in?
Okay.
Okay. I fundamentally disagree that this is circular reasoning, and I fundamentally disagree that that's what's being stated. Now, if you put that to me a minute ago, before you even brought up the circular reasoning points, I would have told you that no, the police don't need to make an argument for themselves because that's not their fucking job. Their job is not to argue with you on the side of the road whether it's just for them to pull you over or not. That's what the judiciary is for. Their job is just to uphold the laws domestically in the state of society. Now, they're in charge specifically because they were hired to do the job that the state hired them to do, whether that state is a republic, a monarchy, or a fucking democracy. They're executing the rules and are empowered to execute the rules because they're qualified to do that fucking job. I mean, you might as well accuse circular reasoning of any business executive. Why are you supervisor of this department? Well, because I was qualified for this position. Because I applied for the job, I was hired for the job, and I'm doing the job. Police are just doing a job.
And if that supervisor doesn't meet any of the qualifications of his job, he can get fired by his boss, and the boss can do whatever he wants because he's on his own property. That's not the same thing as the police. The police,
Why
if
not?
it can, in most cases, even harm private property.
This isn't going to help you with the constant analogy to recent events, because I think recent events only help me here. I think it's kind of a risky move to even try to defend anarchy after recent events. You know?
Well, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, you just got done saying that police, don't get fired, and yet what sparked this whole thing was a police officer who got fired, and his three coworkers getting fired, and
I
their
didn't.
boss disowning them. And
I didn't say any. I didn't say anything about the police not firing their employees. What I'm saying is that you just compared the why the circular reasoning of a police officer is the same as the circular reasoning of the supervisor at a certain company. It's
there's
not the
no
same thing.
circular reasoning though. In either case, there's no circular reasoning there.
The burden of proof is for you to prove that. Give me an interesting.
I'm sorry,
argument
you're the
as to
one
why it's not
accusing me of
circular.
committing. You're the one accusing me of committing a fallacy here. You're saying I'm committing circular reasoning, or the police are committing some sort of circular reasoning. Let's look at this circular reasoning exactly. And I feel like I probably did this in the Filthy Heretic debate. I don't remember it very well. But what exactly? I'm in charge because I'm in charge? Who the fuck is saying that? What value is there in saying that? Who gives a shit? I don't understand the question.
He's not wrong. It is circular reasoning because
if anyone says that, but nobody's saying that.
Whether no one is trying to explicitly say that is another thing from what I'm addressing. What I'm addressing is that people that cannot rationalize or justify their positions but want their positions to be implemented anyway resort to violence. If you cannot
that
argue
seems like a completely separate issue, dude. I'm not sure how that relates to this whole police thing at all.
Of course it can, because by definition, I just said at the beginning, their actions are asymmetrical. They're not based off of consent. Asymmetrical means is
well,
just
no, they're
another
there to
form of
enforce the
reciprocity.
rules, whether you agree with them or not.
And that's why I'm against it.
Well, unfortunately, it's kind of assumes that not everyone's going to follow the rules. If everyone did follow the rules, you wouldn't need the fucking police. So of course you're not going to consent.
Everyone is going to follow.
That's why they're there.
Okay, and what difference does that make? I mean, of course,
it makes all the difference in the world. Rights. Makes the difference whether or not it's justified to have police or not.
Your logic is to, just because some people can't reciprocate rights, we're going to take the consent away off of people who do. That is the logic that you're using here.
Well, people don't just reciprocate rights, do they?
They don't, and not always.
Boom, there you go.
Okay, but
That's why we need some sort of rules. By the way,
I'm not
here's a
against
rule.
rules.
Here's your rights. Well, you're not against rules, but you're in favor of rules being entirely voluntary, apparently.
Yes.
Well, that just fucking nukes all merit there could possibly be in literally any rule ever.
How so?
Because it turns every single rule into a platitude. Oh, you know what, guys? Don't kill each other. I'm not going to stop you from killing each other. I'm not going to impose restrictions from killing each other. I'm not going to deter you from killing each other. I'm not going to punish you for killing each other. Just don't kill each other. I'm sure it will all work out fine. Whatever you do, don't kill each other, because that's going to give the fucking minarchists over there some justification to whip out the police card.
That's not exactly what I'm advocating at all. But anyways,
It's
do you want to
making a
hear?
fucking mockery. Whatever.
Well, it's a mockery. Exactly. It's not exactly what you've mocked my position, but I haven't even brought out my position yet. So
Well, you're contesting that you're contesting that you're saying you specifically said my logic is that we because people don't reciprocate each
some
other's
people don't.
some people don't reciprocate each other's rights. The police are going to unilaterally enforce against people across the board.
Yes, it's a blanket set of rules.
Yes,
Blanket set of rules.
it's a standard. It's a standard. It's equality.
Equality in what? Equality in rights?
Yeah, equality
Okay.
and rights. Because here's the thing, if you have multiple competing security agencies, guess what? There's no standard.
Then by your definition, then, you know, I mean, it's not like now I can establish my own private protection agency, even if there is a state existing. Of course I can. The problem is, it's just, you know, can I really engage in any sort of vigilante action against those who, you know, commit crimes? No, because vigilante action is by definition illegal, right?
Yeah.
The state puts the police in charge in order to enforce the laws, and if I'm just a citizen and I want to bring forth vigilante justice, they don't let me. So what's the point of even establishing a protection agency full of vigilantes if you're not going to get anything done and if you're going to get arrested?
It's a fantastic question. Why on earth would you do that?
Well, I'm just saying, why? Why is that moral in any case? Why should you
Because
even if your intentions are good, even if your intentions are good,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
You can't, and you want to stop people from initiating violence, you still go to jail because it's against the law. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
The legal is not the moral. I think you're conflating.
No. I would never make that mistake, and I will directly correct you right now. The legal is not the moral. However, the legal should be the moral. And what is legal, generally speaking, arrives at that conclusion because of what people take to be moral, at least in terms of like criminal law, right?
Okay. But you
Not
just
all
said
the time, but much of the time.
But you just said that the legal should be the moral. That you
Yeah.
do realize that that isn't only determined based off of your normative opinion. You're gonna have to
What, you mean
convince.
just my particular moral beliefs?
Yeah,
Oh, I'm
because if
fully aware of that. I'm
well, yeah,
completely aware of that. It's other people's moralizing, which is what makes the state into such a fucking egregious piece of shit to begin with. Among other things. Among corporate meddling and all this other shit. Yeah,
okay, corporate meddling.
that
But
happens.
the very
It's an issue. I
existence of
completely
the
agree there.
state, the very existence of the state is to protect some sort of ontological interest. And what I mean by ontological interest is either the interests of individuals by corporations or the interests of the majority or welfare recipients. So it's a conflict of interest that people have engaged to in order to resolve some sort of rivalrousness on resources. That's what I view the state as. It's just this entity that
Where's
protects
this?
people's subjective interests.
Where
And
is the conflict of interest?
This country right now, Republicans are for corporate welfare and Democrats are for giving welfare to the poor. How is that not a conflict of interest? They still
I'd
believe in
say they're
using
both
violence.
for corporate. I think they're both corporatists, personally. But
but they
I'm
disagree on who the welfare should be provided for. But
so you
they're
whoa
not
whoa 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 hold
arguing on
on.
principle. They're arguing based off of
Personal
consequences.
interests, like
Who
special
gets it?
interest groups. Yes, I completely agree with that. But that's not a fundamental thing about governments. You're talking about two political parties who have opposing views on how the government should be run. That's not a conflict of interest inherent to government.
Do you want me to name other governments where there's conflict of interest? Because
You
that'd be
just
like a
named two
long
political
laundry
parties.
list.
Yes, that is going to be a long laundry list. And my rebuttal will be exactly the same. That's not inherent to government. That's not inherent to government. That's not inherent to government. That's not inherent to government.
All right.
You just have
And
two political parties who disagree on how the government is run. The conflict of interest is two people disagreeing.
and to go back to the police example, two political parties who disagree on protecting which minorities' interests by the police. The left believes it's the black lives, and the right believes in some sort of other protection of interests, right? But my point is this: it's just the state consequentially exists as an entity that protects people's self-interest. We can agree with that, right? And whether if your self-interest is to protect yourself from other criminals, in the case of you defending the police, I don't make that argument.
I
I
guess you
believe
could. I guess you could say a very, in a very rough sense, maybe the majority of laws which exist specifically to serve some person or others.
yeah.
Some person or other's self-interest. But even at base, that is being applied to everyone. It's being applied to everyone.
Right.
And there's plenty of shit that exists to protect your interests as well. Multiple of your interests. Especially criminal laws, which deter and prosecute people from doing things to deprive you of your rights. Your rights exist as laws to protect your interests.
Well, the way I view it is that rights are dependent on whose property, they're on.
Whose property they're on.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the politicians don't own the United States, unfortunately.
Of course they don't.
Okay.
Because what is the United States?
It's many different things.
It's many different things. It's a conglomeration of, a geographical region that consists of a conglomeration of people owning property, you could say. The very principle that you said that there should be a blanket set of rules, to,
There's
you
a
could
standard.
say, protect as a standard, violates property norms, violates property rights, because under a voluntary society, people can choose to associate with whoever they want to. And if by any chance, you violate the terms and conditions I've set in that property, I have a right to exclude you from that property. And we can get into the, passive versus active violations of consent
I
as
am
well.
just
But
trying to
at
figure
least
out
in
where
my
you're running
conception, it's
into.
like that.
I'm just trying to find out where you're running into this conflict here, because those two things coexist in the United States today.
Sure. It's just that the state is designed to protect a certain group of people's property interests.
People who have property, yes.
Yes. And I want to eliminate that. I
You want
want to
to?
extract. I want to
Yeah, I don't think you
extract
want to
force
say
from
that so
society.
loosely.
I want to eliminate the state's role in determining what property rights are. I think each individual has the capacity to reason, and by the capacity to reason, each individual has the potential to reciprocate rights. Does it
Well,
mean that they will? It means that they can, and
I
there's always
clearly
an
don't trust
alternative to
you to
what we
make that
have.
decision.
Why not?
Well, because you're obviously arguing for abolishment of the government.
Sure.
All right. Well, there you go. Is that not more than enough reason for me not to trust you to determine what, is what constitutes, fair and reasonable property rights? Because from my perspective, I think that's more than enough. You don't even want a body to you don't want a body to say anything you disagree with. Simultaneously, you don't want a body which could possibly limit what you can do. Doesn't that just set you up as a fucking supervillain?
You're first making a character judgment of me, and
I'm not.
second,
No,
you're
no. I'm
making
not
an
making
argument from
I'm not making a
trust.
character judgment about you. There's nothing personal meant about that. I'm just saying. Think of it. Think of it from like a third person point of view. You're looking at somebody and they say, "I want to get rid of that entity over there because they do things I disagree with, and I want to do this one thing, but they want to limit what I can do."
Right,
And
because
this thing that they're protecting is, infinitely possibly encompassing. Property rights. Property rights. Property rights could expand to so many different things.
sure they can.
Right. So
But
when you want
my
someone to
argument is that
when
it's
you
relative to someone's ownership.
that I don't
My
know how
house
that
is
is
my house.
I don't know how that
My house
segues.
is my house.
I don't
Don't
know how that
trespass my
segues.
house. What do you mean you don't know how that
I
segues?
don't
My
know how
house is
that
my house, and I don't need an entity in order to protect me from people wanting to trespass my house. I can protect my own self from people who trespass my house. I don't need a third party to resolve that conflict.
I would appreciate having a third party that would, deter anyone from fucking with my house when I'm not at my house.
Sure. You know, dispute resolution organizations is a thing under anarchy. It's just
Yeah, but
that
I
they're a
kind of want like a,
privatized version.
standardized, moral expectation that everyone feeds into, so everyone's on the same page about, as opposed to it being like some rogue company with a profit motive.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I'm not a real big fan of protection rackets. What can I say?
I would say I am a supporter of decentralized protection rackets, if you want to say it that way. Everything is minimized, at least to the community level.
It's not beholden to the community, though. It's only beholden to whoever holds the purse strings.
Right. And if someone outside of my community wants to take over and seize my land, you know, there are protection agencies for that, and
So you'd want a military for that.
well, but a military is only one centralized organization. Imagine if there were different competing agencies in order to protect people. The outcome would be much more favorable in that sense, because you're not.
You don't have to have just a singular United States army. You could also have
Right.
state armies.
True.
It's
And
what
private
we
military contractors,
National
depending.
Guard is a thing.
Well, but the National Guard is way is just a faction within the military. It's not, the entire thing. What I'm saying is that there's competing military forces within certain geographical areas, right? There isn't, you know,
You're
one
not
entire military protecting one entire nation against another invading foreign country. Let's
You
say.
seem fixated on the centralized part when I think the issue of something being more centralized as opposed to decentralized is far, far, far less of an issue than the fundamental issue. Oh my fucking god, shut the fuck up. Sorry about that. Is far, far, far less of an issue than the fundamental problem of it being driven by one person funding them versus it's being a democratically state organized defense of society in its entirety.
Okay.
In the one case, you have a protection racket. In the other case, you risk a bureaucracy.
Okay.
It's like
Well,
unfortunately, risking bureaucracy is an implicit issue with government, period. Even minarchism, you risk bureaucracy. But unfortunately, that's part and parcel of the issue of running any sort of state. But you know how you can minimize bureaucracy? Democracy. You get a lot less of it when you have more people making the decisions and being subjected to the decisions. There's a feedback loop of corrections, as opposed to, oh, hey, I voted for this person, but my elector voted for somebody else, and now that person in power is making decisions I don't agree with, and we don't have the power to recall them as a politician. So, oops, we're fucked. Bureaucracy time.
I would completely disagree with that, but okay.
Why would you disagree with that? That's a completely libertarian perspective. I would think, like, even anarchists would agree with that.
Uh, well, I would argue the most inconsistent anarchists because what anarchists want is just uh, yeah. What we want is just privatized legal system. What we want is you know uh, I don't want to say the word state, but geographical region that at least purports that each individual can reciprocate rights through explicit contracts without contradiction.
Okay, so an issue I think we're running into, and something I feel like we probably consistently run into when I debate this topic, is that very keen on talking about first principles. And I agree, first principles are of the utmost importance. But even past us arguing about what constitutes those first principles or rational first principles, we seem to completely sidestep the issue of like actual policy and their mechanics put into practice. Like, there's very little discussion about how democracy works or how a republic works. I mean, you seem unwilling to even accept that a democracy sidesteps some of the problems that a republic puts up, and a republic sidesteps some of the problems that a monarchy puts up. And yet, I would think that would be a completely agreeable thing, even if you don't even like republics or democracies. I don't like republics, but I can concede that they're a degree of separation better than monarchies. You know, at
Okay,
least in
then
fundamental principle.
Okay, then you're just playing the preference game because all
It's
those
not a no, it's
systems.
not a preference game because I just explained to you why this mechanically happens. This happens as a function of how it works. It's not a preference thing. It's not a oh, I like democracies or oh, I like republics. Otherwise, I'd be equally as able to say, "Oh, I like monarchies." No, I'm
Okay,
specifically saying one functions for the betterment of society generally
that's
better
already a
than the
value judgment. You're
it
saying the betterment of society.
yes,
What does that even mean?
there is a value judgment in there because it helps the most people. If you're talking about actually getting what people want, which libertarianism is a fucking value judgment, you value fucking liberty. If you value liberty, then inherently you're going to have to consider on its face between A and B, and if A on aggregate produces circumstances which curtail or modify conditions that produce more aggregate liberty than the alternative, then you can say one results in more liberty than the other, objectively.
Okay,
It's not really a preference game. It's a consequentialist thing.
and that's what I was about to say. Consequentialism is I view it as either you're making an appeal to consequences here or you're directly arguing for consequences in
Okay,
order
so
to defend your
unfortunately,
ideals.
that is a fundamental mistake you just made because an appeal to consequences and consequentialism are completely different things.
Well, appeal to consequences is the logical fallacy that one makes in a form of debate where you're trying to say, well, X and Y won't work because, because of Z, because of the consequences that X and Y entail. That's an appeal of consequences,
No,
so
that
I'll
is
say.
not what an appeal to consequences is. An appeal to
Okay,
consequences is something that personally you disagree with. Like specific, like I'll give you an example, right? So if you're trying to, let me think of a good
something I
example.
disagree with, you were saying?
I'm trying
Sorry,
to
my mic kind of.
yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example for appeal to consequences. It's fairly easy to understand, but it's not merely oh you can't disagree with thing as a result of consequences. Calling that a fallacy is just ridiculous. Now,
Hello?
the appeal to hello, can you hear me at all? Hello.
I can't hear you, dude.
Okay, well I don't know what to tell you. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Can you
So
hear
what
me?
were you saying? Yeah, my connection got
Okay.
okay.
So appeal to consequences. Um, Let me think of a good example offhand. So appeal to consequences would probably be better termed appeal to personal consequences because it's something which you personally find objectionable or something that negatively affects you specifically. So, for example, let's say, um, let's say we're talking about an income tax, right? Set aside your opinions on income tax. I have my own issues with income tax, but let's set aside income tax, right? Now, let's say I'm a millionaire. I make a shit ton of money, right? And we're talking about whether or not we should pass a universal income tax rate that appeals to everybody. Um, I'm not sure if that would be like a capitation tax or not, something like that. Anyway, I make a lot of money. I make a lot more money than most other people, and the other people I'm talking to probably don't make as much money as I do. And when we start arguing about the merits of a income of a income tax of a fixed percentage, there are two ways I could go about it, and both ways would involve One way would be consequentialist, and one way would be an appeal to consequences fallacy. So the consequentialist argument could be that I would say, no, I disagree with an income tax because everyone should be, the recipients of the fruits of their own labor. People who receive the fruits of their own labor are more motivated to work. It results in more productivity. It encourages economic growth. This, that, the other thing. It's better for society overall for us not to have this income tax. Okay? That would be a consequentialist justification for opposing this idea. That is not an appeal to consequences, though. An appeal to consequences would be if someone proposed the same issue, and I'm, again, this millionaire, and I say, no, I disagree, I object to passing this income tax. This income tax is wrong. It's a bad idea, specifically because it would negatively affect me. It would hurt me a lot more. I don't want an income tax. That's an appeal to consequences. It's an appeal to personal consequences. It negatively affects you. It consequentially affects you negatively, and you don't like that. Therefore, you object to it. That doesn't mean the idea is wrong, which is why it's a fallacy. Just because it negatively affects you doesn't make it wrong. There could be any number of possible policies you could suggest that somebody could disagree with because it negatively affects them or not. But you could still make, separately, consequentialist arguments against those policies.
Okay.
So there could be a good consequentialist argument against an income tax, and I would say there is. But you could also, separately, commit a fallacy in the form of an appeal to consequences by objecting to an income tax because, it's my money, though. You know? Do you see that distinction there?
Well, first of all, you only minimize the distinction towards the personal level in terms of
Well,
the
that's
appeal to consequences fallacy.
well,
Well,
that's more or less what it is.
it doesn't work for me, therefore bad, right?
Yeah.
That's not the same thing, at least in the way you were framing it as, I'm going to make an argument for my system just because we're all going to be better off in the long run if we had minarchism, which I don't even know what that. How do you determine whether something is better for society or not?
I might ask you the same thing.
Well, but you can't ask me that because I'm not making any consequentialist arguments here. It's all my arguments are all based deontologically, which I'll get to in a second. But
Yeah, I'll take some issue with that. Anyway, just to reiterate, I've just pulled up the appeal to consequences page on Wikipedia. It's an argument that includes a hypothesis to be either true or false based on whether the premise leads to desirable or undesirable consequences. This is based on an appeal to emotion and is a type of informal fallacy, since the desirability of the premise's consequence does not make the premise true. Categorizing consequences as either desirable or undesirable, such arguments inherently contain subjective points of view. Now, that's not to preclude there being objective value judgments in there. But of course, if you're the sort of person who doesn't think there can even be such a thing as an objective value judgment, then we have a more deeper
that's a contradiction
issue.
in terms.
See, there you go. Yeah, we have a much more fundamental issue with basic matters of truth.
Because I think here's where I think the problem is. It's just that you're conflating consequentialism with your utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the specific consequentialist form of argumentation that you're using in order to defend minarchism.
Okay, so I would be a little bit hesitant to accuse me of saying I'm conflating things when right now I will very casually admit that utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. And I can just be speaking of consequentialism generally. So I don't know why you just accuse me of committing a conflation. It's like saying, "Oh, you keep saying the word rectangle. You're conflating squares with rectangles when clearly you're referring to squares." Well, I can be referring to rectangles as well as squares.
Oh, because you could be referring to squares as a specific quadrilateral, is what I'm saying. You're not specifying, so that you're using a big tent, which is consequentialism, and you have utilitarianism down here in the tent, and you haven't made the utilitarian argument up to
Well,
now.
I'm just not sure what your issue with that is. What's the problem there? Unless you yourself have your own particular brand of consequentialism that you don't want to get confused with what I'm arguing, I'm not sure what purpose it serves to complain about that.
Because do you hear that car beeping? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Here's one of the main problems that I have with utilitarianism. It's just uh, there is no possible way to prove the philosophic calculus to be true. There is no way in order, there's virtually no possible way to prove that you're going to maximize the utility of every single agent in society just because you've implemented some sort of social system, uh, you know, to to I don't want to say preserve, but to serve as a backbone for everything else. It's just impossible. There's just and what that entails is, well, you're defending a system of individualism, but you're using an altruistic system as the moral backbone. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, individuals are part of the collective that makes society. If we make any sort of rules that apply to individuals, it'd be unfair to apply them unequally. So if we apply them to society, it should account for everyone as individuals in society equally.
Okay, but that's not the same thing as, you're saying, okay,
I don't know.
equality of
I don't
rights.
agree with your "it's impossible to gauge utility to" thing. I completely disagree with that as well.
Well, utility and context to what? This is why I don't use a consequentialist argument, because you need a priori concepts in order to contextualize what truth is. You've only said that, well,
I don't think we need
if
a priori concept, so a posteriori will do the job.
well, then how do you make the data relevant to something? How does the data correlate to your principles then? Because you
What
said up
data are
to
you even
now,
talking about?
you said, um, so if we, let me just make a concept. I'm going to betray my own principles here for a second, but just pretend status for a second. I am going to implement an income tax, a flat income tax, uh, because that would lead towards a funding of a stronger military.
Okay.
Right. We need a flat income tax in order to fund a strong, robust military.
Okay.
Okay, that would be an example of a consequentialist argument, right? But you
It
could
could be.
say it could be, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then that just begs the question. So if I asked you, so if a flat income tax didn't work, would you still support it? And obviously, some consequentialists would say, yeah, of course not. I'm all for what pragmatically works, right? But then there is the other conflict when you try to tie in your own principles to that. And I'll give you an example, right?
We just made an example. I'm wondering if we've just immediately drifted away from the income tax to fund a military thing.
I was going to get to my point. I was saying, what if this thing that works in the short term transiently doesn't work in the long run, which isn't what consequentialists look at. They don't look at the conflict um, of time, which results as an issue towards circumstances arising and their
Sure.
principles being at stake.
People who don't do that are making huge mistake. They absolutely should be factoring time into that. That's something I bring up about utilitarianism quite a bit. People seem to think that, oh well, if something is acceptable in the short term, that means it's always acceptable, and yet in the long term, it turns out to be a horrible proposition. Well, that doesn't balance out with the bird's eye view. You look at it, if you consider utility in the grand scheme of things, if this proposed policy is not ideal in the long term and it's not caveated to only be a short-term policy, then you should object to it on principle because it's not a good policy.
But who decides what long and short term is? That's what I'm saying. What metric
It
are you trying to
completely
use?
depends on the
Because you're saying,
circumstances of what we're talking about, man. I don't know.
I know.
It's totally up for
That's
debate.
not one. Then since that point is moot and it's up for debate. Therefore, you can't say it's objective. That's
I
the point that
really
I'm
just
saying.
no. I completely disagree with that, man. I completely disagree with that. I don't know how you can come off with that saying that you can't be objective when you leave yourself open to caveats and exceptions and circumstantial improvisation. I mean, my mind immediately goes towards, okay, what is the total metric value of me subjugating our economy in order to produce additional bullets for our soldiers for us to win the war that if we don't win, our entire nation is going to be subjugated and our people is going to be genocided. You saying that's a hypothetical possibility in which you're gauging short-term interests versus long-term interests, and you're saying you
Right.
can't be objective about that just because it depends on the circumstances. Come on.
Because you've already said that there's outliers to that, right? And if it's dependent on circumstances, it's become a relative issue, not an objective issue. An objective
You
issue
can.
has to be
They're not.
something
You
that is
can't.
universally applicable at all situations.
No, that's absolutism. You just made a mistake there. What you're describing is absolutism. I'm talking about objective.
Well, absolutism is a form of objectivism. Because
Absolutism is a form of object. No, it's not. No, it's not. The neat dichotomies are absolutism versus relativism, and objectivism versus subjectivism. I completely reject this notion of absolutism. Completely. A lot of people argue for like objective morality and they call it objective morality, and yet they talk about like absolute statements like thou shalt not kill under any circumstances. Lying, stealing, and cheating is always wrong no matter the situation. No, that's not objective. That's not objective. That borders on talking about ontological objectivity, which is completely separate and should not be confused with normative statements at all. But that's absolutism. I'm not arguing for absolutism. And if you're saying
okay,
absolutism is a form of objectivity, then even if I accept that for sake of arguments, then I'd say, okay, that's not the form of objectivity I'm talking about. Because if you're going to be objective at all in a scientific sense, which is, I would say, the most meaningful form of objectivity, that is absolutely relative to circumstances. You cannot take a case study. You cannot do like an experiment with involving chemistry and try to see how one chemical reacts with another chemical and say that it's objective because you're absolutely disregarding circumstances. It doesn't matter. It applies all the same time. It doesn't matter what the temperature of the room is I'm conducting the experiment is. It doesn't matter the quantity of either liquid I'm using. No, when this touches this, it explodes and goes boom. Boom is good. This is good. Always do this. That's not objectivity. And that's not what flies as scientific. That's not what flies as, having the veracity of, scientific objectivity. It's not what I would ever advocate for.
Okay. Also, and by the way, thou shalt not kill is, I wouldn't even consider that form of absolutism. Those are just
No?
no. They're
Why
just
not?
they're not in the realm of objectivity. They're just commandments that purport to how you shouldn't behave. It's morality has nothing to do with you refraining from certain behaviors. It can, but it's not the whole totality of it. So I don't know why you would bring out "Thou should not kill." I'm
Well,
not
because it's
for.
an absolute
I mean,
statement.
I don't prescribe to the Ten Commandments.
I don't know how you
Sure,
could
it's an
disagree.
absolute statement, but
Well,
it's not.
that's my whole point.
It's it's not even applicable from a rationalistic point of view in all situations.
It's not
That's just
rational,
that's
period.
morality is just not okay. I said rationalistic. Rationalistic and rational aren't the same thing. Rationalistic is, you know, you assuming that two concepts serve as a priori and working your way backwards to prove those a priori concepts.
Well,
That's not what I'm doing.
we're not even doing anything rationalistic with "Thou shalt not kill." It's just a statement. It's an assertion. It's an absolute assertion.
Sure, it is. Right, but that
It
isn't the same. That isn't the same. An absolute statement, right, can still be objectively false, right?
Sure.
Sure, right.
Yeah.
Like if I say that, you know, all men believe that the moon is made out of cheese, right, for some reason,
Mm-hmm.
then that's obviously false. Not every person believes in such a ludicrous thing, but you know, it's an absolute statement, but it's not objective. I'm using when I say absolutist, at least in the moral sense, it has to correlate with what's objective. I'm not talking about whatever
What?
statement you pull out of your back pocket and proclaim it to be as universal or absolute. What I'm saying is that this principle applies in all circumstances without contradiction, right? So
That doesn't apply to "Thou shalt not kill"?
no, a
Why not? It's
principle
just
that
it,
implies.
but that's what it is. I don't know how you could disagree with that. "Thou shalt not kill."
Yeah, and
Fuck your
obviously
circumstances. No subtext to it. No caveats. No nothing. Don't kill. That's all it
right,
is.
an absolute statement, but does that principle always work in reality? No, it
Of
doesn't. People
course
kill
not.
all the time. So
Well, no.
that's what
What?
I'm saying.
Whoa, hold on. This is very. I don't know why you would go at it from that angle. It doesn't work in It's not a realistic policy in reality because there is nuance, because there are exceptions, because there
Right?
are relative circumstances to consider in which you could make a much more objective judgments on what a rational policy would be. I don't know why you would say like, "Oh, well, it's not a realist policy in practice because people still kill." Well, what?
No, because
Making a
no,
policy
because
does not prevent the thing from
no,
happening
no,
without
no,
enforcement.
no, no, because that's not the only way that I'm looking at it. I'm looking at it as you need to craft a certain principle that can at least circumvent those outliers from happening. Those people that do not believe in "Thou shalt not kill." Do you understand me?
Sure, I would agree with that.
But that isn't a consequentialist position. A
Of
consequentialist
course it
position.
is.
No,
Absolutely.
it's
When
not.
when you craft legislation, you should absolutely craft the legislation to account for all possible varying circumstances. That is absolutely a consequentialist approach. Why would you not want to pass legislation without loopholes?
And if that legislation stops working for the consequentialists, I'll just move to another principle, right?
I don't know what that means.
You don't know what that means?
I don't know
So
what
so
you're talking about.
so socialism stops working in my country. I'll just revert back to capitalism, whatever
Okay,
that
well, I
means.
would say
Right.
socialism never worked in your country, no matter what country it was.
Depends on what you define as efficacy, because for them,
I
until
I
the
don't know
last
what,
penny is
dude.
spent,
I
it
don't know why
works.
you even said consequentialism before. You say socialism works for consequentialism up until it doesn't. That doesn't make any sense to me.
No, what I said was I'm just giving you conjecture. I'm just saying that for the consequentialist, principles are always in conflict with each other because it's dependent on circumstances. That's what I'm saying. They always shift. They always alternate around.
Yes, you should
Yes.
account for that when you make objectively good policy.
Well, and I would say that even if communism worked for some magical reason, I still wouldn't support it. I still wouldn't hold it as
Sure.
morally good just because it works for
Well,
some
I guess
reason.
it depends on what we're talking about when we say communism works, because some people like to bootstrap a whole
That's what I'm saying. That's
morality
what.
onto that.
No, actually, no. If you come to look at it, commies barely use moral reasoning to justify communism. They're not interested in morals at all.
Okay, but I mean, if I'm just discussing communism, there is the whole new man aspect to it, where, you know, you only enter full communism once humanity has collectively reformed into being selfless automatons. So there is a moral aspect to it. So you just got to be careful not to get that confused in, your points regarding communism.
Well, no, because when I said you asked on, it depends on what you mean on how it works, and that's exactly what I'm saying. What you determine as efficacy is relevant to each
What do
individual,
you
or I'm
mean when
sorry,
you say as
relative
efficacy?
efficacy, the efficaciousness of something, whether
Oh, the
something is
efficacy.
the
You
efficacy of
you have
something.
some weird pronunciations.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's the content what matters, not the way I
No,
pronounce that
I get you.
context.
I know what you're talking about now.
Right. Um, I think what the problem is here is that we're disagreeing on the efficaciousness of something working in principle. Because I'm not arguing based off the efficaciousness of anything. I'm just arguing based off of slavery is wrong no matter if an individual or a collective inflicts it onto another person. A equals A. Right.
Okay.
That's the law of identity. Slavery is bad no matter which
Uh,
ontological standard you're trying to prescribe into it.
I think you ran into, I think you just tripped over a couple issues right there. It,
Okay, then you can pick me back up and we'll discover what those issues are, but that's at least my position.
well, you can say slavery is wrong. There's no objection to that from me, but I don't think it's I don't think it's good to say that's the law of identity. Law of
Of
identity is
course
not.
it is.
It's not though. The law of
The
identity
law
is
of
just a.
identity is A equals A,
The
right?
law of identity regards when that a thing is always itself.
A
You
thing is
just
always itself.
yes, but you just tautologically saying that slavery is wrong because slavery is wrong also verges on you doing the same shit you accused me of doing earlier, which is circular logic.
No, I didn't say slavery was wrong because slavery was wrong. I was saying that slavery is wrong no matter, hence, it's independent of whether an individual or collective does it. Slavery is wrong no matter what, is what I'm saying.
That is nothing. I don't know how that caveat, no matter the circumstance, no matter who is
The,
doing it, I don't know how that
and no
applies to
matter,
the law of identity at all.
I said it was similar to the law of identity.
I
I
don't think
didn't
it's even
say it was.
similar, man. But anyway, let's get off
Fair
of this.
enough.
Let's get
No,
off of
okay.
this. Um, okay. Well, it seems like we definitely got hung up on the subjective, objective, relative thing. I think it's a very simple, and I tried my best to explain it in terms of like chemistry. You can arrive at objective conclusions that take account for relative circumstances. And I would say that you must if you're to have any sort of objective conclusions. Disregarding relative circumstances is how you end up with absolutism, which is not objective.
Okay.
So when you suppose a policy, even one against slavery, you can have an objective conclusion about whether slavery is acceptable or not acceptable, and even account for various circumstances in which things could be interpreted as slavery when crafting this policy, considering
Okay.
relative circumstances. And that would be non absolutist and it would be non relativistic or subjectivistic. You could have an objective value judgment about slavery and you could implement it as policy, and that could be law.
Okay. Um, some issues there. I'll get to it. First of all, uh, you're going, like I said before, sure, you're trying to derive policy based off of the favorable consequences that entail once you enact that policy into action. But number one, I would say that the consequences of one's action is largely transient. This goes back to my same point before. It's just how do you measure the efficaciousness of a certain action in the long term or in the short term? I'm not going to get into that now. That's my first point. My second point is, uh, you know, when we're talking about objective morality in general, I fall along the side as sure, in order to arrive at certain principles, you need to observe things in reality first, right? So I'll give you an example. Um, in order for me to value my own survival and to make some certain, into, you know, take some certain actions in order to preserve my own survival, I need to first observe what survival is and what are the necessary requirements for survival. So, sure, some principles are derived from past consequences or at least from objective data. But that objective data is meaningless if there is no a priori truths in order to conceptualize it. If there is no um, method that you can say, well, the data correlates with this idea, right? And the data, doesn't change because it's always going to be correlated to this idea, right? It's not the data isn't transient. It isn't relative to like, what part of the map you're on, right? It just it's just absolute in the sense it's universally applicable, right? And we have a
I
priori
would be
truths in order to
very
contextualize
resistant to
this.
start. I would be very resistant to start using absolutes as a term of universality. Because
Fair enough.
I advocate like universality and standards and talking about things being unilateral across the board and stuff, but I really would not use absolute to describe things in those terms. It can really confuse the idea.
Right, fair enough. But you know, I just want to make that clear. It's just you know the problems that I have with consequentialism is that there is no fundamental argument to even argue for liberty, for example. There is none because it's
I would certainly say there is.
well how we're going to be more prosperous. We're going to be there's higher living standards, right? Those
Certainly.
those Sure, right, but that's, you know, okay, but
But what's your issue
that's
with
kind of
that?
what why okay, but it begs the question, because if you're already saying, well, higher living standards under this system, comparing an opposing social system that doesn't have liberty, okay, but why is high living standards even a metric in terms of consideration?
Oh,
Why
that's fair.
it's completely random and arbitrary is what I'm
I
saying.
I wouldn't say it's random or arbitrary at all, but at the same time, I would suppose someone's being random and arbitrary if that's like their primary metric. If you're talking about well-being of people, there's a lot of things that contributes to people's well-being. One of the most important things that contributes to someone's well-being is freedom and bodily autonomy, and excuse me, bodily autonomy, and being able to do, what you want within reason. And
Sure.
so there's when we talk about different things that can affect you, that affect you positively or negatively regarding your well-being, your health, your diet, your living conditions, quality of education you receive, quality of your parents, the proximity of you living to other people with high levels of well-being, your proximity to crime, your ability to feel like you're meaningfully participating in society. It could expand outward ad infinitum, but I like to visualize it as like a tree, right? If reason why I'm libertarian is because near the bottom of that tree, liberty is the root of so many of these things. Liberty is the root of so many of these things. Liberty is what gives liberty is upstream. I guess I should say liberty is upstream of your market activity. It's upstream of the content you consume. It's upstream of what you do as a profession. It's upstream of the literal physical control over your own body. It's upstream of the ability to have whatever opinions you want to have. It is an overarching value that encompasses many sub values within it. And if if liberty is also downstream of well-being, well-being can be modified by other things that are not necessarily relevant to liberty. Well-being can be affected by environmental factors that have nothing to do with you, including like your living conditions. Not necessarily your ability to get those living conditions, but you know, living conditions. And so it is hypothetically possible that you have some sort of policy where, oh yeah, we're gonna advocate a system which gives you amazing living conditions. That's what's going to make our society great and prosperous. But because of how that policy operates, say by way of an egregious taxation, that could actually deprive you of liberty in the process. And so while you may be increasing well-being in one department, so say a relatively narrow niche department like living standards or just house quality or some shit like that, while raising that, you'd be pushing down the scale in the liberty department. And so it's a cost benefit analysis. And I think you can have an objective cost benefit analysis in that respect. If it's a 1-to-1 comparison, just ask yourself, what makes for a better society, generally speaking, by taking from someone's personal liberties and pumping it into their homes without them having any say? Or is it better for them to decide whether or not to do with that money and improve their home living conditions, if that's what they so choose to do with that money? What generally makes for a better society? What logically would make for a better society? What throughout history has shown makes for a better society? Taking people's money and spending it on shit they don't want? Or giving it giving them the freedom to, you know, spend on what they want and expand out on what they want, being entrepreneurs in ways they want, all that shit. I don't think I'm making absolute statements by saying this. I don't think it robs the concept of objectivity by saying you can debate these things, by welcoming anyone to debate these things. I think asking these questions is important, and answering these questions is important, and actually considering the cost benefit analysis in these competing things is important. It's not just living circumstances are good all the time, always, number one priority, boom, do that. No, consider passing this policy could have a negative detriment to liberty. Is the cost of that liberty a justified loss or justified price for the living conditions you're buying with it? And then from a utilitarian perspective or a consequentialist perspective, sorry, I keep rambling. From a utilitarian perspective or consequentialist perspective, maybe in the short term, you think, oh shit, there's so many people who are living in rundown housing, we got to improve their homes. And you might make some shitty, shallow consequentialist argument that, oh yeah, we totally need this housing. Liberty can suck itself for a while. But if you step back and you consider the big picture, does this in general, does this principle of, yeah, we could take a little bit of your freedom off the top, just so long as we give you what we think you deserve or what you should have, as opposed to what you want?
Sure. And what do you think is happening right now with this whole coronavirus shamble? Is people giving
Exactly.
up the
That's a
principle of freedom for security, safety, and health?
that is a perfect example. I would completely side with you on that, and I'm trying to appeal to your sense of liberty on this.
Right. But
I hope it's working.
so since you've given your, and now I'll try to wrap this up in at least in 9 minutes. So
Oh,
since
you
you've
gotta go.
given your, yeah,
Okay.
so since you've given your, let's say your consequentialist arguments to why I defend liberty, I'll use my, deontological arguments on why I defend liberty.
No, okay.
I think, and I particularly differ from those who use self ownership as their axiom in order to defend property rights and
Really?
individual liberty. Right. I don't I subscribe to that. I don't argue against self ownership because that would be a contradiction. But um, I would say it isn't my axiom on ethics, and I have an ethics PDF that I can link to you that I wrote on what I think of self ownership. But here's what I think about liberty. I think liberty is an essential characteristic in order for man to exercise his reason. I think that
Mm-hmm.
anything that undermines the individual, uh, anything that undermines the individual's capacity to reason is a direct form of either, some sort of, natural physical characteristic that person has. Maybe that person doesn't have the capacity to reason at all. But anything other than that is usually artificial. Everything other than that is usually, well, force was applied onto that person in order to strip their reasoning power away from them, or at least nullify their skull enough in order to stop valuing things and instead start obeying the whim of their master. Right? So force is completely antagonistic to values, mind, and ultimately, you could argue, to well-being. Force is something that I consider as immoral because it is asymmetric. It does not correlate to how ethical alternatives work in reality. I'll give you an example. The person who wants to survive, let's just use that as a form of contingent statement, right? If I want to survive, I must do X. Well, X entails a lot of things. X could entail working for a living, or X could entail me stealing from you in order for me to live, right? Be it taxation, um, right? That's not a form of morality. I don't consider contingent statements a form of morality, at least in a priori. But I consider a form of objective morality is what I call correlative ethics. And what correlative ethics is just you correlating certain rules of conduct or maxims onto yourself, without contradiction. And that could imply the use of force and not the use of force, right? So if I have problems in restraining my own whims, then I'll tend or correlate to restrain the behavior of others, just like I outlined in my correlative ethics book. If you can't restrain yourself, you'll find a way to restrain others, right? There is that tendency, that objective correlation between you not assigning any rules of conduct for yourself and therefore depending on either a state or a governing rule of body in order to make rules of conduct for everyone, which is what you were for at the beginning of the debate, and or you coming up to a mob and then sabotaging the freedoms of everyone else, right? So for me, a thief is someone who violates the principle of non-contradiction because they're using their own autonomy to limit someone else's autonomy, right? That's what I consider the initiation of force as. It's
Would you
by
say that
definition
they're breaking the golden rule?
asymmetric. Well, here's my criticism of the golden rule. The golden rule looks for universality. I'm not looking for universality. I'm
Oh,
looking
okay.
as to whether something something works without contradiction in reality. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying is it's more on the lines of it's sort of like Ayn Rand's objectivism. I don't know if you've read on her that much, where she said that force was the enemy of reason. But I'm not using any of the consequentialist type arguments that she would give. Like she would give, well, force undermines your self interest and things like that. And the Kantians would say, well, force cannot be universally preferable, like Stefan Molyneux likes to say, which is completely retarded. But anyways, so I'm not arguing for universality or any sort of ontological standard, like you should do this to promote your self-interest or you should do this to promote the collective interest, things like that. What I'm saying is that theft is immoral because it's asymmetric behavior. It's impossible to apply at all times because that would entail that we're all stealing from each other, which is impossible, right? Because in order for theft to take place, there needs to be a person who's stealing and a person who is stolen from. So we can't all steal from each other just from a rationalistic perspective. If we hold theft as a principle, it's impossible. There's just no way into purporting that as absolute without falling into contradiction. So,
I think I have some persistent issues with just how you try to make certain ideas relates to other ideas. Like I would not.
all I'm saying is theft is immoral because it's asymmetric. It's impossible to apply consistently in reality.
I don't really know what that means though. Like it's hard to parse
So,
that.
so you think everyone can steal and be stolen from at the same time without contradiction?
Yeah, I mean it happens.
So I can
Sure seems to
so
happen.
so I can both steal from you and be stolen from you at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. How's
Um,
that? How is that not? How is that
All
not
right.
contradictory?
If we live
I
in the same nation, I'm probably spending your tax dollars in some way, and you're probably spending my tax dollars in some way. I guess I just don't understand where you're trying to approach this from at base. Like, are you saying like theft is wrong as an acceptable principle? Like, as in like
theft is
we
wrong.
can't
Is
advocate
exactly.
theft
I'm not
because
saying you can't advocate theft. That'd be absurd. What I'm saying is that
I,
you
I'm honestly having trouble
you can't
understanding what you're saying.
advocate theft without falling into logical contradiction. You
Well, I'd
can't.
be a hypocrite
Yeah, it's a
because I don't want
performative
to be.
contradiction.
I'd be. I would just say it's hypocritical. Like, I don't want to be stolen from, but I'm willing to steal from someone else. Fuck
There
me.
is, I didn't say anything about wanting, right? I'm just saying, I can't steal from you and be stolen at the same time. That's impossible.
I don't know why you say that's impossible. It's not at
Okay,
all outside the realm of possibility. So I honestly don't know. You're there's
okay.
some sort of gears turning that I'm not aware of.
I reached back in Omnizo's pocket, right?
Okay.
And then at the same time, I'm being stolen from Omnizoa. How does that make any sense?
What's wrong with that?
I reached I reached for $1 in your back pocket,
As I'm reaching for $1 in your front packet.
in your front packet, right?
Packet.
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 But then, who's the last person who's going to get stolen from in that instance? If we just
What does it
applied
matter?
that at all
You just showed it's
times.
possible.
No, but there's a contradiction there. Who's
Why?
the last person?
You're in that case. There's no contradiction. We're both willing to steal from each other.
We're both stealing from each other, but we're not both being stolen from. Theft involves, it's asymmetrical. It's someone.
I don't know what you mean by that, man. I
Do you know
really
what
don't.
asymmetrical
I know
means?
what asymmetrical means, but it makes no sense in context to me. Like,
Okay.
I'm stealing from you, ergo I'm benefiting at your expense. If that's what you mean by asymmetrical, okay. But that doesn't render it mutually exclusive with you doing the exact same thing to me, separately. And again, I don't know how this
Well,
relates to anything else we've been talking about, honestly.
of course it does, because I said at the beginning I was going to make a deontological argument for why theft is wrong, and you made a consequentialist argument before why you think theft is wrong because it's not pragmatic or whatever
it's
type of.
not it's not conducive to a productive society.
It's not
I
conducive to a
wasn't
productive
specific about
society.
theft, though, but whatever.
Well, you said that you were using consequentialist arguments to defend liberty, and so that implies, well, the
Sure.
opposite must be false, right? The theft, which is antagonistic to that, that must be conducive to a, what is it you said, a productive society. Well, then, yeah, that's I'm, but I'm not making a consequentialist argument. What I'm saying is deontologically, you know, that principle of theft can't be applied by everyone at all circumstances without contradiction. It's impossible.
I
At
just
least
struggle to parse
rationalistically.
what that means, and I don't think rationalistically helps when you throw that word in there. It doesn't really resolve my confusion.
Okay, so I guess then you don't understand the concept of theft then, because theft would involve
What?
some a victim and someone who aggresses that
Yes,
victim.
sure.
Sure,
I can
sure.
I'm aware of this.
So how does theft suddenly become everyone's everyone's aggressing and everyone's being victimized at the same time? How does that work?
Well,
At some
it
point,
doesn't
people.
work if you're unwilling to accept that somebody can also be a victim of something and an oppressor at the same time.
Sure, there's a lot of situations in which people are victims and are oppressors at something,
I don't
but that
know
doesn't
that we need to
necessarily.
contextualize the basic idea of theft in terms of oppressors and oppressed, though.
Then how do you solve conflicts within human behavior if
Well,
it's not viewed in certain
human
terms of
behavior
symmetry?
human behavior doesn't have to be elevated to this grand notion of oppression. You can just talk about this person's taking something that belongs to this other person.
Yeah,
There,
as if
yeah.
that's not oppressive enough.
Well,
As
you
if
can call it
someone
oppressive all you
expropriating my
want.
property is not
You
oppressive.
can you can call it oppressive all you want, but it's like when you're insisting that we're defining it in these terms, and then when you define it in these terms, it's like logically impossible in some respects. Like that doesn't make like completely goes over my head. Like I don't know what you're talking about at that point. I see literally no reason why it is physically impossible for me to take something out of your pocket while you're taking something out of mine. Literally nothing is inhibiting either of us from doing that to each other, other than the fact that we're not physically right next to each other right now.
That is not what I'm saying. What
Well,
I'm
that's
saying
all
is,
I can. It's all I'm getting from this.
can you take something out of my back pocket and also be stolen from at the same time?
Of
That
course.
those Okay, really?
Yes. Why not?
Really?
Really? Why not? I mean, that's
Relative
that's
to
that's what I
relative
just
to what
described, and you
property?
said that's not relative to what?
Can
What difference does it
can
make?
Okay, I'll give you an example. Can you
Okay,
want to steal and to be stolen from?
sure. I don't know why.
So if I really, so
Yeah,
I
it would be
can
irrational as fuck, but
fe-
you could.
theft is a violation of consent. So you can't value theft without falling into contradiction. No, you can't. No, you can't.
I
It's like
don't know why you keep
murder.
the impossibility aspect is what trips me up the most because I don't know why you're saying any of this is impossible. And honestly, what gets me the most is that you're claiming this is a deontological thing, but you're trying to derive normative
Correlative
statements out
ethics
of
is
this supposed impossibility, and it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know why it is not more. I don't know why it's not simpler, more straightforward, more clear, more concise, more absorbable by your average human being, consumer, user of the English language to just say it is not conducive to other people's well being to steal things which belong to them. Like that's all I need to say, but you're making some grand statements about metaphysical impossibilities and shit. I completely don't understand it. And I feel like I feel like I'm intelligent. Oh, okay, he dropped. Fuck. It looks like you disabled your microphone and camera. There we go. Hello.
uh yeah, so I was saying you still haven't answered my question.
What is your
Still,
question?
can you want to steal and want to be stolen from at the same time? You
Sure.
can't want to be stolen from. Theft is
I
a violation
I
of
disagree
consent.
with that.
Therefore, you're not wanting anything in that situation.
I welcome you to
Okay.
take anything that belongs to me.
Well, if,
Take it without my permission. Now that
all right.
itself is a little
Well,
silly.
look, dude. Look, dude. Okay. And
Honestly,
you're
well,
just critiquing. You're
I think the
you're
problem.
insulting my arguments without
I
any
have no
backup
idea what your
as to
arguments
why.
are, though, dude. That's my issue. I don't know how you making some statements about whether me wanting someone to steal from me has any relation. to anything. I don't know why you need to
Because
go
that's
to that level to deontologically argue against theft. I feel like it's super unnecessary. I feel like it's super convoluted. It doesn't make sense to me. I feel like if it was sensical enough, I'd be able to absorb it relatively easily. But it's going over my head, man, and I've had so many arguments regarding this sort of shit before. So I don't know what to tell you.
well, dude. I guess we can leave it here. I guess.
Okay. I'd like to say one last thing because I didn't get to address it before. You said something to the effect that force is like the enemy of reason, or it's antithetical to having values.
Yes, it is.
I disagree with that. I think if you want to protect those values against the state of nature, you absolutely will require force as a last resort.
Okay.
And those values are infinite and inclusive of reason.
All right, fair enough. If you want, I can link you the Correlative Ethics book, and you can figure out what my arguments are, since you weren't grasping them here.
If you want, you're welcome to do so. Now, I don't know if you feel like we're ending lots of background noise. I don't know if you're feeling like we're ending this off on a bad note, but I would like to say I liked this conversation much more than my one with Filthy Heretic by a lot. Honestly.
Yeah, because the other one was just semantical battles that you guys had. You guys were debating the definition of government for 30 minutes,
It was a
literally.
lot it was a lot of snarky shit. It was a lot of snarky condescending shit, and it super was not productive at all. Thanks for having the conversation, dude.
All right, this was a productive conversation. I enjoyed it. By the way,
Alright.
I'll link you that PDF. It's free, and you can get it on, I think, Google Docs is it, and then publish it on Amazon soon. So
Okay.
maybe we can delve into correlative ethics next time. But this was a fun conversation, at least for today. All right,
Alright, cool, yeah.
take care.
Yep, have a good one.